it is for me an honor and a privilege to be here among you today, here in this country, Tunisia, which recently revealed itself to be so absolutely unique. And an even greater honor to be the first of the guest speakers invited to this conference to address you, my fellow participants. As the title of my paper suggests, my credentials are in philosophy and the social sciences. More broadly speaking, I am a littéraire rather than an activiste militant, which, however, by no means implies that I do not have very strong political and ethical convictions. Quite the contrary would be closer to the truth. As it tests the paper, I will now submit to your kind attention. Freedom and responsibility. Reflections on the nature of their inseparability. As the question addressed by this conference is that of the dynamics of resistance and discontent, and as any and all forms of ethically motivated resistance, as well as any and all morally warranted manifestations or movements of discontent, are necessarily, implicitly or explicitly, associated with, if not indissociable from, a conception, or at the very least, an interpretation of each and both of these all so human notions. We have chosen freedom and responsibility as the theme of our communication, and more specifically the nature of the kinship that has united them from time immemorial. Kinship to which we have given the name of inseparability. In a world everywhere abandoned by most, if not all, its traditional certainties, whether these be religious, ideological, political, ethical, philosophical, or yes, even scientific, and in so many parts of it seemingly delivered over on a scale hitherto unsurpassed to crisis, generalized confusion, and raging conflict, a world exposed on all sides to that process described by Schumpeter as creative destruction, process that Nicolas Bouzou places at the heart of his own economic theory. It seems to us that it is more than ever necessary, indeed vital, indispensable, to never for a moment lose sight of what these two notions, freedom and responsibility, signify, and more importantly, to never for a moment forget the fact that they can only signify anything when taken together, that neither of them signifies anything when dissociated from the other. History has pitilessly, relentlessly demonstrated to us the havoc dissociating them reaps, the desolation and destruction acting in the name of one to the detriment, or worse, to the exclusion of the other, inevitably brings in its wake. One of the most striking, as well as one of the most faithful translations into figurative form of the fundamental nature of their relationship to one another, has always seemed to me to be the two faces of Janus. In Roman mythology, the god who is at one and the same time the guardian of portals and the patron of beginnings and endings. One face facing in one direction, the other in the opposite direction. But faces eternally inseparable because each and both inseparable from the same entity. For no more than the outside of a portal can exist in the absence of an inside, no more than the beginning can exist without an end, can freedom exist in the absence of responsibility, or responsibility in the absence of freedom? I was 13 when I read the Brothers Karamazov for the first time. I don't know if many of you have read it. It marked me profoundly for life, for many reasons, but the principal one was the role played in this novel by these two so singularly human notions that concern me here. For if the Brothers Karamazov is a novel, it is above all one which, besides telling, like all novels, are more or less interesting stories, proposes inexhaustible matter for innumerable potential subjects of reflection, among them the subject of our present reflections. For the roles played by freedom and responsibility on the stage of the lives lived by those very particular living creatures known as human beings was a recurrent, or perhaps more precisely pervasive, theme in all Dostoevsky's novels. But in none other was it so central, so explicitly developed as in his last, The Brothers Karamazov. The question of the nature of the bond, because it is of the nature of a bond, that unites these two bodiless actors, haunted and tormented Dostoevsky throughout his life. He never ceased examining, questioning the nature of the relationship bonding these two perfectly immaterial beings, brought into being and subsequently nurtured by the mind, spirit, and imagination of a long list of specimens of this particularly turbulent species, known for some time now, in spite of its profound and often obstinate ignorance, as Homo sapiens, trying to find answers to the many questions it raised in him. He tried many answers, but never found one that entirely satisfied him. Neither have any of us. We are perhaps none of us here present as obsessed as Dostoevsky himself was by the question of the nature and extent of man's freedom, the nature and extent of man's responsibility, and more specifically by the consequences, potentially, if not inevitably disastrous, of dissociating the exercise of one from the exercise of the other. But each of us has certainly a personal definition, conception, or interpretation, in part inherited, in part self-created, of what each of them, freedom and responsibility, is, or at least of what each of them is not. I am sure that all of us here present would agree, for example, that freedom is not doing whatever you like, whenever and wherever you like, or acting instinctively. Indeed, apart from the so-called instinct of self-preservation, it is open to question what other instincts remain to the human animal, or even whether anything that resembles what could be called instinct continues to determine his behavior in any sphere of activity or any arena of action. I am equally sure that we would also all agree that the profoundly ethical notion of responsibility has nothing to do with guilt, which is not a notion of any kind, ethical, conceptual, or other, but an emotion, and more precisely, what in psychoanalytical terminology is known as an affect, much less with taking upon yourself other people's destinies, deciding in their stead, because you have decided that they aren't fit to do so themselves, what is best for them. Dostoevsky, of course, knew all this himself. So, to go back to the Brothers Karamazov, there are in all 4 brothers, 3 legitimate, 1 illegitimate. But we will be concerned here only with the 2, each of whom incarnates one of Dostoevsky's principal responses to this overwhelming question that devoured him, that of the nature of freedom and responsibility, and more specifically, of the nature of the relationship that binds them necessarily and inextricably one to the other. The brothers Alyosha and Ivan. To simplify, we might say that Alyosha incarnates the spiritual response, for he has chosen to become a monk. Ivan, the intellectual one. But their respective positions are not so simple as that. For each of them partakes to a certain extent of the position of the other, and their responses to the fundamentally existential questions they debate in the two chapters of the novel that concern me here, Rebellion and the Grand Inquisitor, complement more than they challenge one another. We are all responsible for all. I don't know where I read this one-sentence summary, synthesis, of Dostoevsky's conception of the nature of responsibility. Said in exactly those terms, I doubt that it figures anywhere in any one of his novels. In any case, in the novel that concerns us here, The Brothers Karamazov, it is voiced in the following tones by Father Zosima, Alyosha's mentor, at a particularly critical moment when, à la Socrate, knowing that he is soon to die, he has assembled around him his fellow monks and disciples to impart to them his last words of wisdom. For know, dear ones, that every one of us is undoubtedly responsible for all men and everything on earth, each one personally, for all mankind and every individual man. This knowledge is the crown of life for the monk and for every man. For monks are not a special sort of man, but only what all men ought to be. And at another moment, as soon as you sincerely make yourself responsible for everything and for all men, you will see at once that you have found salvation. On the other hand, by throwing your indolence and impotence on others, you will end by sharing the pride of Satan and murmuring against God. How to even begin to comprehend, much less defend, such a declaration, affirmation, which on the surface seems to defy common sense, appears so patently excessive, so palpably extravagant? Perhaps by one and the same time restating it and clarifying, justifying it in less exalted, more prosaic language. For once it has been admitted, and I think all of us assembled here would admit it, that our planet Earth, we, meaning all its living inhabitants, and first and foremost all those living inhabitants known as human, have become and are increasingly becoming members of a universal family. Once we have then taken the step that follows logically from the first one, which I imagine all of us here have already taken, that consists in avowing and perhaps also personally assuming our role as that singular species of living beings whose activity has increasingly determined and is now, for all intents and purposes, alone at the helm of the destiny of this possibly absolutely unique planet. Suddenly, Father Zosima's, in other words, Dostoevsky's enunciation, becomes not only perfectly comprehensible, but is incontestable, therefore has no longer any need of defense. For if in fact, and it is now a well-established fact, a daily reality and no longer a hypothetical state of affairs, we are all connected in one way or another. Taels de Chardin foresaw this worldwide form of connection, but only its uplifting not its potentially nefarious consequences. If what is now done in one part of the world affects in one way or another, more or less immediately, what happens in all the other parts, and moreover we know this, as in fact we do, then follows Zosima's final words of wisdom, far from being the pious sermonizing or the enigmatic errant ramblings of a monk on the threshold of death, reveal themselves what they truly are. The words of the most profound rationality and the most sublime common sense. They are, in fact, these words uttered indirectly by Dostoevsky, one of the many proofs of which we dispose of the extent to which the Russian novelist was in this, as in so many other respects, ahead of his time. Psychoanalysis, for example, is much indebted to him for his insights into the subterranean workings of the human soul. For we need only to detach the message contained in and conveyed by these final words of wisdom of the Holy Father from the setting in which they are pronounced, a monk's cell in a monastery, to be able to immediately recognize the universal ethical, to be rigorously distinguished from religious truth they express. For these words have fundamentally nothing to do with God, only everything to do with man and mankind. Let us try to demonstrate this by citing examples of formulations of the same truth taken from authors and texts that can in no way be suspected of adhering to, expounding, or propounding any kind of otherworldly vision or view of the world or of the nature or destiny of humanity. We alluded earlier to Taels de Chardin's foreseeing of the worldwide connection we are now living, at one and the same time benefiting and suffering from. In the article entitled Homo et la fin des certitudes, he contributed to number 95 of the review Communication. Pascal P., who can hardly be considered the exponent of any form of religiosity, says this about his reading of Taels de Chardin. En ce qui me concerne, la lecture de Taels de Chardin, si j'en récuse l'aspect théologique d'une évolution conduisant au Christ cosmique, j'en accepte le principe de responsabilité. L'homme est une espèce qui a pris conscience de sa place dans l'histoire de la vie et qui en est devenu responsable. And first and foremost, we might add, for the story, histoire, of his own life, that is. For while claiming that we are accountable, responsible, answerable for our own coming into the world, that is, our own birth, as in fact it has been claimed here and there by some markedly dubious schools of thought, it's a highly questionable, as well as virtually undefendable and inherently unverifiable assertion. It is, on the other hand, incontestable that from a certain age onwards, the members of the very particular species we constitute become in fact accountable, responsible, answerable for the existence their birth has bestowed on them, for the way they choose to live it, for not only their acts, but their way of thinking, seeing the world, and living in it, sharing it, with not only fellow members of their own species, but with the members of all other living beings. In her most recently published novel, Les Enténébrés, the novelist, essayist, psychoanalyst, Sousse alludes to La responsabilité morale qu'implique le fait d'exister et d'avoir chaque jour, à chaque instant, à se comporter avec noblesse et dignité. Difficult, if not impossible, to determine when exactly, at what precise moment in the development of a human being, it becomes incumbent on him to assume this moral responsibility. The fact of existing in the form in which he exists imposes on him. Which could lead to our asking a certain number of questions as to what exactly the verb to exist means. For example, we might ask ourselves whether it applies to all living beings, or why not, even to inanimate objects. Do animals exist in the way the human animal does? Or for that matter, chairs and tables? The linguistic elements of which the verb is composed, ex, out, forth, and sistere, to cause to stand, which taken together could be taken to mean something like standing out, standing forth, make it difficult not to ascribe existence in its fullest sense to the human animal alone. For if animals and chairs and tables indubitably exist in the sense that they have reality or actual being, they do not stand out or stand forth from this reality. They are, on the contrary, an integral, entirely integrated part of the reality they share with the world around them. Happily for them, perhaps. Not not separated from it, outside, or in front of it in any way. Whereas we, the human animal, are separated from both reality and world, essentially. That is, by what has become our very nature. It is precisely this state of at one and the same time existential and essential separation from what might be called the living substance of life, indicated and denoted by the prefix X, that, so to speak, in the same breath, imposes moral responsibility on the human animal and endows him with the capacity, the privilege of being able to think, decide, act freely. To choose, for example, in the words of Sousse, to behave nobly and with dignity. For the standing out, standing forth from his mere being in the world that has become intrinsic to his particular form and way of being, has made natural for him what is natural for no other species, putting between both what occurs in him and what occurs around him, that so exceptional kind of distance that is called reflection. Sousse sets the bar very high. Maurice Blanchot sets it even higher. I spent more or less 10 years preoccupied by the thought of this, how to call him. The only denomination that seems to me to cover everything is precisely thinker. Admittedly, not a very elegant formulation, the thought of a thinker, from a stylistic point of view, but inevitable in this case, since it is the only one that is entirely appropriate. A thought which itself is everywhere and at every instant, occupied with and preoccupied by precisely the twin notions we have chosen to place at the heart of our paper. To give you an idea of the complexity of this thought, a few excerpts which I will then comment one after the other. I only give you my English translation. I was created responsible, the bearer of a responsibility that is prior to my birth, as it is external to my consent, to my liberty, born thanks to a mark of favor which also happens to be a predestination. In this first excerpt from L'Écriture du Désastre, the author of these lines states that by virtue of his condition of having been born a human animal, like all members of this particular species, for it is clear that he is not making this statement only about himself personally, he was born bearing responsibility that antedates his own birth, which is therefore not personally his own, that exists outside not only the realm of his assent or consent, but even outside that of the range of his personal freedom, and that if we humans willingly consider our birth as being a mark of favor, we must not forget for an instant that this favor carries along with it a heavy obligation, that of assuming what no other animal has had to assume, namely a destiny, and inseparable from this destiny, a role that no other animal has had to play on our planet Earth. Considered more closely, these words are perhaps not so enigmatical as they first appear. For the human animal is incontestably born the bearer of the very long evolutionary development, for which, if he personally is obviously not personally responsible, the simple fact of being born then, and more and more fully existing, makes of him at once the incarnation and the prolongation. Another way of saying this might be to say that the responsibility Maurice Blanchot speaks of here is in a certain sense our heritage. He, we, have inherited it from all the generations that have preceded our individual coming into existence. But the mark of favor accorded by the very special form of existence we human beings are endowed with is far from being free of charge. On the contrary, requires of us that we transmit this heritage of responsibility, at the very least intact, if not enriched by our passage, to those who come after us. Even though this heritage, it is not even fleetingly ours, does not at any moment belong to any one of us. But how could it, given what it is? A responsibility that exceeds exponentially the individual responsibility attributable to each of us. Speaking once again in the first person, and once again not simply for or as himself, but rather as a specimen, a representative of the species, earlier on in L'Écriture du Désastre, Blanchot says this: "The responsibility I have been put in charge of is not mine, and means that I am no longer me." Another seemingly paradoxical pronouncement, but which, if we consider it in the light of what we have just said regarding the first excerpt, that is to say, we consider what we have called our heritage of responsibility as having been handed down through millennia, not by individuals, but by the human species itself, its history, its evolution, becomes in its turn immediately limpidly clear. For I have been put in charge of this responsibility not because of who I am personally, individually, but as a consequence of belonging to the particular species I belong to, and I assume it, if I indeed do, not only or even primarily as an individual self, but rather in my role as one member of the infinitely long chain of living beings that led to my ephemeral existence. It is to this chain that I am eternally indebted for the possibility of being free, and to which I therefore owe the conscientious exercise of the responsibility which is this possibility's own condition of possibility. Blanchot again. Responsibility, this word so trite, so commonplace, this notion whose most readily accessible, easily assimilated moral definition, political one, makes of it our duty. We have to try to hear, understand it, as Lévinas has renewed it, opened it up, to the point of making it mean beyond all meaning, the responsibility for philosophy altogether different, which remains, however, in many respects, the one that has prevailed since time immemorial. Responsible. In general, this is a term that describes, prosaically and conventionally speaking, a man who is mature, lucid, and fully conscious of what he is doing, who acts with moderation, takes into account all the elements of a given situation, knows how to calculate his moves and when to take decisions, the successful man of action. But here, responsibility, my responsibility for others, for all others, by definition devoid of reciprocity, is displaced, no longer belongs to the realm of consciousness or conscience, is not the implementation of an efficacious reflection. It is not even a duty that is imposed from within or without. My responsibility for the others, supposes an upheaval so drastic that it can only be marked by a change in the status of the self, a change of time, and perhaps a change of language. Responsibility that withdraws me from my order, perhaps from all order. Like his dialogue with Georges Bataille, Blanchot's dialogue with Lévinas was of many years' duration. This is not the place to go into the ethical questions that preoccupy Lévinas or his responses to them. Let us just note the affinity with Dostoevsky's notion of responsibility as expressed by Father Zosima, that is reflected here in that of Lévinas as represented by Blanchot. My responsibility for others, for all others, is a responsibility which in no way hinges on its being reciprocal, which therefore in no way can be seen as an exchange, which cannot even be considered as a choice made by me as to the attitude towards others I wish to adopt, or the kind of relationship I wish to have with them, and least of all as a duty imposed from within by my individual conscience, or from without by the moral values of the culture and society I belong to. And finally, répondre de ce qui échappe à la responsabilité, to answer for what defies answerability. Admittedly not the most elegant translation, but the only one that makes it possible to preserve the kinship, the common roots of the verb and the noun, so manifest in French. At first sight, the most conscientiously obscure of the four excerpts. What kind of action or event that defies answerability can we nevertheless be held answerable for? It is, of course, Auschwitz that comes immediately to mind. But there's an example much closer to hand and to home that will at the same time allow us to rejoin our point of departure, Dostoevsky and the brothers Karamazov. For in the chapter entitled Rebellion, that immediately precedes the Grand Inquisitor, Dostoevsky, in the person of Ivan, responds to this question in a way that renders Blanchot's seemingly so obscure, terse pronouncement unanswerably clear, by addressing the question of the suffering inflicted on innocent, defenseless children. A question that, sadly, recent events in many parts of the world, and not just in Syria, Yemen, or Libya, but also on the border between the US of A in Mexico have once again brought to the forefront of our attention, once again made excruciatingly relevant. After having related to his brother Alyosha, whom we must not forget is a monk, several appalling stories of sufferings inflicted by so-called grown-up people on helpless children they for one reason or another had power over, Ivan has apparently compiled a collection of figgy-bale involving precisely this particular kind of unspeakable cruelty. He asks him, Alyosha, do you understand why this infamy must be and is permitted? And goes on to say, I must have justice, and not justice in some infinite time and space, but here on earth. Justice that I can see myself. I have believed in it. I want to see it. And if I am dead by then, let me rise again, for if it all happens without me, it will be too unfair. Surely I haven't suffered simply that I may grow the soil of future harmony for somebody else. I want to see with my own eyes the lamb lie down with the lion and the victim rise up and embrace his murderer. I want to be there when everyone suddenly understands what it has all been about. All the religions of the world are built on this longing, and I am a believer. But then, there are the children, and what am I to do about them? If all must pay for future harmony, what have children to do with it? It's beyond all comprehension why they should suffer and why they should pay for harmony. And if it is really true that they must share responsibility for their father's crimes, such a truth is not of this world and is beyond my comprehension. Ivan, the self-proclaimed atheist, nevertheless wants to believe. But a God who can allow innocent children to suffer abominably, this God he cannot embrace. For, like the devil, he has been created in man's own pathetically imperfect image. And he goes on to say, if the sufferings of children go to swell the sum of sufferings which was necessary to pay for truth, then I protest that the truth is not worth such a price. And neither is harmony, whose price is also beyond our means to pay, if the condition of its establishment on earth is sufferings of this kind. And so, given all this, like any honest man would do, he is giving back his entrance ticket. This is what Alyosha calls his brother's rebellion. After having replied that he is sorry his brother calls it that, because one can hardly live in rebellion, and I want to live, Ivan proposes a kind of hypothetical deal to his brother. Imagine that you are creating a fabric of human destiny with the object of making men happy in the end, giving them peace and rest at last. Imagine that you are doing this, but that it is essential and inevitable to torture to death only one tiny creature. That child beating its breast with its fist, for instance, in order to found that edifice on its unavenged tears. Would you consent to be the architect on those conditions? Tell me the truth. No, I wouldn't consent. I wouldn't consent, said Alyosha softly. And can you accept the idea that the men for whom you are building would agree to receive their happiness from the unatoned blood of a little victim, and accepting it would remain happy forever? No, I can't admit it, said Alyosha. Here, Alyosha assumes the responsibility for depriving humanity of eternal happiness, peace, and rest because of the sole condition imposed, that this happiness, peace, and rest be founded on a single child being tortured to death. Here, he in fact answers for what defies answerability. For such a decision is clearly beyond the scope of human comprehension of what, as human beings, we can normally be held answerable or accountable for. We real flesh and blood specimens of the human species have obviously never been offered such a deal by God or by any other authority, faced with the possibility, the necessity of making such a decision. And not only are children being starved to death, tortured, and massacred in many parts of our present-day world so regularly that it has made, in fact, of this a kind of fait divers, what the term designates in French means a trivial news item. But there is no promise proper coming from any higher authority that in exchange for this mass suffering and slaughter, humanity will at last be granted happiness, peace, and rest. We who are, in facto, now in charge of the course our planet is taking, and will continue to take, how can we allow such horrors to continue to be perpetrated, as if we were answerable to no one and for nothing? How is it that we, presumably so much more knowledgeable than Dostoevsky's contemporaries, continue to allow children to be subjected to so many horrors, the victims of so many atrocities? If he were here today, Dostoevsky would be horrified to note that in spite of all the immediate knowledge available to us of what is going on everywhere, at every instant on our planet, we do so little to alleviate at least the sufferings of those little ones, the innocent, defenseless children. As for us, the grown-ups, he has little sympathy for our sufferings, perhaps rightly so. For having eaten the apple, having thus acquired the knowledge of good and evil, well, we have only ourselves to blame for what we bring on ourselves. This said, what we bring on ourselves, we often, unfortunately, bring at the same time on many others as well. What we call these days collateral damage. To go back to the dialogue between Ivan and Alyosha where we left it off, after having turned down Ivan's imaginary deal, Alyosha has only one recourse, to invoke he who can forgive everything, all and for all, because he gave his innocent blood for all and everything. To which Ivan replies that he had been wondering all the time how it was that his brother hadn't brought him in before. For usually, all arguments on your side put him in the foreground. Which leads to Ivan's confession that he had once made up, written, but only in his head, a prose poem, a fable, that he had called The Grand Inquisitor. At the heart of this prose poem or fable is precisely the theme that concerns us here, the inseparability of freedom and responsibility. In Ivan's fable, we are in Seville at the height of the reign of terror propagated by the Inquisition, when fires were lighted every day to the glory of God, and in the splendid act of faith, the wicked heretics were burnt. The day following a particularly magnificent auto da fe, a stranger appears in the streets of the city. The people immediately recognize him. They flock around him, follow him. He restores sight to a man blind from childhood so that, as he implores, he may see him. Then he raises a dead child from her coffin. At this moment, the Grand Inquisitor, an old man of 90, emaciated but still tall and erect, and in whose eyes smolders a feverish gleam, chances to pass by the cathedral where the child's funeral was to have been celebrated, followed by the holy guard that accompanies him everywhere. He understands immediately, or at least thinks he does, what the situation is, orders the guards to arrest the stranger, whom they then lead to and lock in the prison in the ancient palace of the Holy Inquisition. The people, too intimidated by the power of the old cardinal, too accustomed to obeying his will, do not react. No one moves, no one protests. When he who has returned for their sake is condemned once again. But the Grand Inquisitor needs to know, to speak with the stranger who may not, but equally may well be him. So in the middle of the night, with only a candle to light his way, he descends alone into the vault where the prisoner's cell is to be found, opens the door, enters, and confronts him. To deliver himself of a veritable indictment which is only brought to an end by the break of day. The prisoner only listens, never at any moment speaks. In any case, from the outset, he is forbidden to speak. Don't answer, be silent. What canst thou say, indeed? I know too well what thou wouldst say, and thou hast no right to add anything to what thou hast said of old. Why then art thou come to hinder us? To hinder who exactly? Those who have carried on his work in his name, carried it on and completed it in the only way conceivable, by correcting it. The appointed agents, representatives of the Roman Church. What precisely does the old man reproach his prisoner with? Precisely with not having taken possession of man's freedom. That freedom he is born with, when he could have. Worse yet, with having made it, this intolerable freedom, greater than ever. With having forgotten that man prefers peace and even death to freedom of choice in the knowledge of good and evil. That he is tormented by no greater fear than to find someone quickly to whom he can hand over that gift of freedom with which he is born. By way of a preliminary charge, he declares to his prisoner soon after entering his cell, "For 15 centuries we have been wrestling with thy freedom, but now it is ended and over for good. Dost thou not believe that it's over for good? Thou lookest meekly at me, and deignest not even to be angry with me. But let me tell thee that now people are more persuaded than ever that they have perfect freedom. Yet they have brought their freedom to us and laid it humbly at our feet." A bit later in their interview, he says this, "Thou wast warned, but thou didst not listen to those warnings." When Alyosha questions Ivan as to what the Grand Inquisitor means by warnings, he replies that that is precisely the chief part of what the old man has to say, which we discover consists of a lengthy reminder of the 3 deals offered him, the 3 temptations he was submitted to in the wilderness, by the one the Grand Inquisitor calls the wise and dread spirit. The first of the proposals or temptations can be summed up thus: "Turn these stones scattered around us into bread, and man will follow you, obey you blindly." To which we have been told that Jesus answered that man does not live by bread alone. The second can be considered a challenge. Having set Jesus on the pinnacle of the temple, he challenges his faith in the following terms: "If thou wouldst know whether thou art the Son of God, then cast thyself down, for it is written, the angels shall hold him up lest he fall and bruise himself. And thou shalt know then whether thou art the Son of God, and shalt prove then how great is thy faith in thy Father. But as doing so would be testing God. In other words, the very opposite of an apt demonstration or proof of faith would have made him unworthy of the mission he believed he had been sent on earth to accomplish. Jesus once again rejects the proposal. It's only 2 pages. And finally, the wise and dread spirit sets Jesus before the panorama of all the kingdoms of the earth and offers them to him, offers him the possibility of ruling over them. Had thou accepted that last offer of the mighty spirit, concludes the old inquisitor, thou wouldst have accomplished all that man seeks on earth, that is, someone to worship, someone to keep his conscience, and some means of uniting all in one unanimous and harmonious anti, because the craving for universal unity is the third and last anguish of men. Hadst thou taken the world and Caesar's plunder, thou wouldst have founded a universal state and have given universal peace. For who can rule men if not he who holds their conscience and their bread in his hands? But for the third time, Jesus rejects the offer made him, preferring to rule only in the hearts of men and as a consequence of their free choice of love freely given, and not the base raptures of the slave before the might that has overawed him forever. He refuses all 3 deals the devil offers him. Why? Precisely because his work was not founded on what the corrupted version of it alluded to by the ground inquisitor is founded upon, namely miracle, mystery, and authority. Because he had too much respect for man to enslave him in any way. Because he wanted to be followed, if he was followed, by a free decision of the heart and mind of each one of those who followed him. To this the Grand Inquisitor counters, respecting him, that is man. Less, thou wouldst have asked less from him. That would have been more like love, for his burden would have been lighter. For he continues, apart from the elect, the mass of humanity is too weak and vile to be able to make a free decision for themselves. And as for the elect, the old man goes on to say that freedom, free thought, and science will lead them into such straits and will bring them face to face with such marvels and insoluble mysteries that some of them, the fierce and rebellious, will destroy themselves. Others, rebellious but weak, will destroy one another. The rest, weak and unhappy, will crawl fawning to our feet and whine to us, yes, you were right, you alone possess his mystery, and we come back to you. Save us from ourselves. How? What in the mind of the old inquisitor are they asking him and his like to do? Above all, to take off their shoulders the unbearable burden the one they had followed had made them believe they could bear. At this point, Alyosha interrupts Ivan's telling of his fable prose poem by crying out that his poem is in fact in praise of Jesus, not in blame of him as he meant it to be, which of course is absolutely true. For in Ivan's fable or prose poem, we have one of the most scathing, uncompromising indictments of mankind, not only as it existed at the time Dostoevsky wrote this novel, but as it existed before and sadly continues to exist today. Everyone against it. For if the Inquisition has long since ceased to exist, so many forms of the same kind of repression have sprouted up since then and have undertaken the same work of torturing and putting to death those who show signs of being inhabited by the desire and the capacity to exercise at one and the same time the freedom and the responsibility inseparable from it that Dostoevsky's figure of Christ incarnates. So many other movements, religious and political, have defiled human intelligence as much, if not more, than those whom Dostoevsky accuses of having taken it upon themselves to correct Jesus' work. And if what he calls the Roman Church no longer has anything like the power it had in the 15th century, in part at least due to its having defiled itself by permitting its elite to indulge over centuries in certain abominable practices for which they went and continue to go unpunished, there has been no lack of other equally scabrous authorities to invest themselves and exercise for longer or shorter periods the same kind of power. How to conclude? I think the only way to conclude is by saying that if mankind as a whole, or at least the vast majority of it, does not cease in the very near future, confirming by its behavior the judgment voiced by Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor, that it is inherently too weak and vicious to assume that freedom, inseparable from responsibility, which it alone has been offered the possibility of exercising, it will end up going the way of the dinosaurs. Or to return to the review Les Incertitudes, if we continue to feel sorrowfully abandoned by our traditional certainties, instead of choosing to abandon them for ways of thinking and doing more adapted to the world as it now exists, and which we have created and are responsible for, we will end up being abandoned by life itself, fed up with our cowardice and our constant betrayals of the values it has bestowed only on us to be able to defend and uphold. We are doomed, the human species, if we cannot learn not to need certainties, and more importantly, not to need to constantly relieve ourselves of the burden of our freedom by laying it at the feet of one or another authority, none of which is worthy of receiving such an offering. The possibility only we humans possess of thinking and acting at once, freely and responsibly. In the article he contributed to Les Incertitudes, entitled Créativité et complexité en temps de crise, en choc des mentalités, Alfonso Montuori, referring to R.J. Bernstein's The Abuse of Evil, Politics and Religion after 9/11, says this. Bernstein ne diabolise pas la religion, à l'instar des nouveaux athées. Il esquisse plutôt le contour de deux mentalités radicalement différentes. L'une ouverte, faillibiliste, et comme je vais tenter de le démontrer, complexe, créative et collaborative. L'autre fermée, dogmatique et polarisante. En réponse à la critique selon laquelle aucune action décisive, et encore moins morale, n'est possible sans absolu, il détaille sa conception pragmatiste, au terme de laquelle il n'y a aucune incompatibilité entre être décisif et reconnaître la faillibilité et les limites de nos choix et décisions. Au contraire, c'est là ce qui est nécessaire à une action responsable. Pour Bernstein, il est essentiel d'aller au-delà du grand et séduisant ou et de trouver une autre voie qui reconnaisse le caractère inévitable de l'incertitude et la limitation de la connaissance humaine, précisément afin d'agir de façon responsable et non avec étroitesse d'esprit. Morin plaide également pour une éthique qui reconnaisse et intègre l'incertitude et la complexité et qui devra inclure une prise de conscience de l'écologie de l'action, ce qui signifie que, quelle que soit notre intention, toute action n'existe que dans un contexte et un milieu écologique. Et nous ne pouvons jamais être sûrs de la façon dont même les actions les mieux intentionnées peuvent tourner. Let us do our best in our thought and our actions to raise ourselves up to the level of the first mentality sketched by Bernstein, each one to the extent that his individual capacities permit. Thank you.